For the next several weeks, we'll be studying America's involvement in what becomes known as the Vietnam War. To help us better understand the Vietnamese people and their culture and their history, the purpose of this video is to look at that early history of Vietnam going up to World War II. Looking at the map of Southeast Asia, here's the area that becomes known as Vietnam. For over 1,000 years, this area was the southernmost province of their northern neighbor, China. For most of this time, the Vietnamese people fiercely resisted the rule of their large northern neighbor. Their resistance generated some of Vietnam's iconic national heroes. In 39 AD, the Trung sisters, seen here mounted atop elephants, led the first major rebellion against the Chinese. Though the rebellion was unsuccessful, and they drowned themselves in a lake in Hanoi, their martyrdom inspired generations. Another iconic hero was Tran Hung Dao. Under his leadership, the Vietnamese successfully fought off the legendary Mongol warrior Kublai Khan 3 separate times during the 13th century. Tran Hung Dao pioneered the methods of guerrilla warfare that would later be used against the French and eventually the Americans. Moving ahead to the 19th century, Southeast Asia was being carved up by European colonial powers. In this image, we see French forces fighting in the northern province called Tonkin. By 1900, the French had gained control of the entire Southeast Asian peninsula, and it became a colony known as French Indochina, which included the states of Tonkin, Annam, Cochin China, Cambodia, and Laos. For the people of Southeast Asia, life under French rule was harsh. The French established unreasonable tax burdens on the local populations. Example, wine. Throughout history, the Vietnamese people had made their own wine primarily out of rice, but winemaking became a French monopoly, and to be caught producing wine brought about the severest penalties. The French controlled all financial institutions, and as such they established incredibly high interest rates, making it very difficult for local people to get the loans they needed to fund businesses. Prior to French control, 70% of Vietnamese people had owned their own land. This land was taken away during French rule and largely given to wealthy French landowners. The local population were reduced to sharecropping and tenant farming. Some of this land was granted to the Michelin Rubber Corporation, which used it to establish rubber plantations, as can be seen in this image. If you look carefully, you can see these diagonal stripes going down the sides of the trees. That's how you would harvest the rubber. You would make that slit, you would hang these buckets below it, and the sap would run down into these buckets, very much like you see people here in Maine tap maple trees in the spring. Here you can see the rubber sap being poured through a strainer into large holding vats. Conditions on the Michelin rubber plantations were extremely harsh. Out of 45,000 workers, 12,000 will die of starvation and disease. The Vietnamese will resist French imperialism just as vigorously as they had the Chinese. The French will brutally suppress these demonstrations, jailing as many as 10,000 dissidents, and they even used aircraft to drop bombs on demonstrators. Resistance to French rule generated a new round of national heroes. For our story, we'll focus on Huynh Sinh Cuong, seen here. Huynh learned a lot from his father. His father had been a government official in the late 1800s, but when the French gained control over Indochina, Huynh's father resigned his position rather than serve under the French. In 1912, Huynh left Vietnam, and he worked as a cabin boy and a cook, both in America and in France, until he eventually settled in France with a colony of Vietnamese nationalists. Living in Paris, Huynh took on a job as a photographer's assistant with a French newspaper called The Outcast. He adopted the name Huynh Ai Quoc, which means Huynh the Patriot, and together with other Vietnamese nationalists, they worked towards the independence of Vietnam. During the Paris Peace Accords, which brought an end to World War I, Huynh petitioned for democratic reforms in Vietnam, but he was refused admission to the peace talks. Nevertheless, word spread about his attempts of Huynh Ai Quoc to pressure France for independence. He became renowned in Vietnam. Soon afterwards, he became a founding member of the French Communist Party. He spent the next 2 decades traveling between the Soviet Union, China, Thailand, and Vietnam. In 1930, he organized the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. In 1940, the Japanese moved south into French Indochina. They demanded of the French commanders that they submit to Japanese rule. By this point, the French government had fallen to the Nazis, and so the French commanders had to make this decision on their own, and they decided to submit. The effect that this had on the Vietnamese people immediately was one of awe, because they saw Asian people like themselves so easily overcoming their French rulers. But soon, that awe would be replaced with discontent because of the harsh rule of the Japanese. It's estimated that in the northern state of Tonkin, out of a population of 8 million people, 2 million will die during the war of starvation. Both the French and the Japanese prohibited any relief efforts for the Vietnamese people. When the Japanese invaded Southeast Asia in 1940, Huynh Ai Quoc returned to his homeland and assumed the name Ho Chi Minh. He established a base just south of the Chinese border, where he founded an organization known as the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh by 1945 had raised an army of nearly 5,000 soldiers, and they received training and supplies by the Office of Strategic Services, which would later become known as the Central Intelligence Agency. The United States saw the Viet Minh as a helpful resource in their fight against the Japanese. The Viet Minh army systematically harassed the Japanese, and they stole food from the French and Japanese supplies to distribute to the Vietnamese people. When the Japanese eventually surrendered in August of 1945, the Viet Minh opportunistically filled the vacuum, occupying government headquarters, especially in the north up in Hanoi. Ho Chi Minh, seen here in September of 1945, dressed in his faded khaki suit, the rubber sandals which you can't see. He stood before cheering crowds on September 2nd, and he proclaimed the independence of his country, in words strikingly similar to those used by Thomas Jefferson.